Harrison, appreciate your time, man. I'm excited to hear more about your journey. To start, I want to take it back to the inception of HeadCheck Health. Give us the rundown on like how you even came up with this idea and when you actually saw it as a viable business opportunity.
Yeah, thanks, Malcolm. So for me, this all started 2012. I was sitting in the crowd at Neuroscience Research Australia's main auditorium, and I was about to go on stage to make my first academic presentation. So I was a master's student in a concussion research lab, and I was really nervous to give this presentation because I'd been building a sensor-based concussion test that was more accurate than anything else that was out there. And at these conferences, the in the crowd is all the people that run the concussion research labs around the world. And it's after the presentation that you have these interactions. And if they like your work and what you're doing, then they might offer you a PhD position, and then you can continue on. And we were going to be able to continue to develop the sensor and solve this problem of concussion in sport. So I crushed the presentation, and then afterwards, I was disappointed because only three people came up to me. One was genuinely interested in, the concussion sensor, and the other two just wanted to know if I knew where the bathroom was. So it was that point where I started to realize that maybe building a concussion test wasn't going to help me achieve my mission, which was I wanted to eliminate concussions from being mismanaged in sports. And yeah, so I returned back to my university and I accepted a PhD position at the lab that I was already in, and that was primarily because there wasn't other suitors. But I kept, researching and building this tool and validating it, and sinking hundreds of thousands of dollars into developing this test. And yeah, one day I'm sitting at my computer analyzing the data, and I start to realize like, oh wow, none of the data is actually correlating with the injuries. And we were collecting data with the football team. But also all the other tests that the medical team was using were also not correlating with the injury. And so I was really frustrated. So I flipped over to ESPN and started checking some football scores. And I saw the headline that changed everything for me. And that was something along the lines of NFL is being sued $1 billion for mismanaging concussions. So that was in 2012. And so I obviously excited because, I'm working on $1 billion problem here, right? But I've also got all this data that's just perhaps leading to the point that the test is not going to be able to fix that problem. And so I got really interested in the NFL lawsuit, and that was a domino effect for this industry. So shortly after that, universities started getting sued, high schools, community sports teams, where athletes were having their head injuries mismanaged, and now the athletes wanted to hold them accountable for it. And when I started to dig into these lawsuits and look at the expert opinions and the witnesses and whatnot, there was not a single case where it had said you used Malcolm's test for concussion. If you had been using Harrison's test, then we all wouldn't be here. And so that was my first indication that like maybe the problem in the concussion space is not that there's a bad test, it's not a test problem. And every single one of those cases, it was something completely different that led to the mismanagement. And that was that there was a mandatory protocol that didn't get followed. And so it started to pique my interest on maybe the problem in this industry isn't a test problem, it's a compliance problem. And so, yeah, what we ended up doing at HeadCheck is we built a system where organizations could do 100% of their protocols, the tests, but also at this time, protocols were exploding to include spotter programs and many different tests, different individuals involved in the care, clearance procedures, all this sort of thing. And so our theory at the time was that there wasn't a technology to actually do all the things so that you could have the data to actually see if people were following the protocols. So we built that and we rolled it out with our first cohort of organizations, and we were shocked. Something like 30% of the times a concussion happened were the players actually getting cared for according to that protocol. And so again, we've now identified the problem here is actually a compliance issue. And so what that means is that for every player in these organizations that had a concussion that was managed appropriately, there was at least another one that didn't. And that was going to be, they were going to be exposed to all these horrible risks of head injuries. And so we just got really good at one thing, and that was helping the organizations, of course, do their protocols and measure compliance. We were the first group that was able to do that. but getting really, really good at increasing compliance. So even today, one of our goals with our organizations is how can we get you to be 100% compliant? And we know if we do that, we reduce the risk for everyone, reduce the risk for the player, reduce the risk for the league, reduce the risk for the medical folks, and so on and so forth.
No, that's amazing, and it's a lot to unpack there. I kind of want to stick at the beginning of the story a little bit and talk about your conviction around this problem because
Yeah.
obviously you've worked on this for a long time, 10 plus years, as you mentioned, hundreds of thousands of dollars, invested in this product to build this company.
Yeah.
What gives you so much passion and conviction about this space?
Yeah, I think it's the humans that are part of this, right? Like I'm not sure about yourself, but I know so many people in my circle that have had concussions and have had bad outcomes where, they had to take time off work or, they had to drop out of school or things like that. And it tears apart families, right? And the thing that really gave me so much conviction about going after this problem is that it's preventable, right? Like if the problem was that we don't have this fancy piece of technology that is, measuring brain waves and whatnot, then that's a really hard problem to solve. But the problem was actually a lot simpler. And to your point, it was a very unsexy problem, which is no, there's this list of things that experts said have to occur, and nobody checks because there is no way to do all these things and aggregate that into a fashion to be able to analyze it.
hmm And can you talk about the business as like where it stands today? Like, what's the model? And even more so, can you like present a case study of like how you guys are positively impacting athletes and organizations?
Yeah, so we're a vertical SaaS business, super niche what we do. A lot of people probably don't even know that this type of technology exists. And so we sell a subscription to our clients on an annual basis, and that subscription is a factor of how complex their protocol is. So we're not trying to change their protocol. We're just giving them a better way to do 100% of it, and then use that data to figure out if they're compliant, and if they're not compliant, then fix it. So yeah, we've got 20 staff at the moment. We're growing our revenues at about 50% year over year. But the biggest thing I'd say is coming back to our mission of trying to eliminate concussions from being mismanaged. We're from our data, we believe that we're preventing about 15,000 concussions from being prevented every single year. And at the same time, we're working with all types of organizations. So pro leagues, amateur sports leagues, community sports leagues, high schools, colleges, and even crazy stuff like military. And so if you think that something as strict as the military would have this compliance issue, you can just imagine how bad it is at the grassroots level.
And so going back to the beginning, I want to talk about some of the challenges that you faced early on. Like, can you talk about what were some of the hurdles you had to overcome, whether it was like pivoting, figuring out what the root cause was, or even like mass adoption for the product? Like, what were some of those early challenges like for you?
Yeah, I mean, the big one, just from a founder's perspective, was because I came from the science stream. Like I was a master's of science, and then I was in PhD studies. There was a assumption that I wasn't a business person and I lacked business training, and I was never going to be able to be, the leader of a business because I was, a typical science-minded person. I was going to want everything to be perfect before it launched. And I think there's a lot of literature out there that says with companies like this, you got to get the product out there, have customers use it, and then figure out whether it's actually delivering on the value that they wanted. And that happened to us, right? Like we were selling them a sensor to better test for one piece of a concussion, and that's not what they needed. They came back to us and they said, "Hey, it's great that this one piece of the assessment is more accurate, but that's not preventing people from being mismanaged." So we were forced to pivot probably 5 years, a full master's degree, half a PhD, a couple $100,000 with investor money. We were forced to pivot after all that. And in reality, we perhaps could have had that pivot earlier on and maybe save some money and save some time. But the only way that we were ever going to figure out that that was the right pivot was learning from the customer. And I think, again, that comes back to the limitation that was put on me, which was I'm not going to get this out in the world soon enough to get that feedback to make the right pivot.
Hmm. What are some of the differences in how maybe professional teams, colleges, youth programs, and you also mentioned the military, how they view and handle concussion management? Are there any nuances in how those different organizations or levels kind of managed concussion protocol?
Yeah, I mean, the reality of it is the vast majority of concussion protocols at every level are fairly similar. There's, a recognize and report, and you might test for a diagnosis. And then there's a recovery phase, and then there's a clearance. So every protocol, whether you're, little kids or you're a professional sports team, you're doing that, but you're just doing it in different ways. And the biggest nuance is at the amateur level, these protocols are being executed by non-medical people, right? So it's volunteer moms and dads that are also the coach and bringing the oranges to the sideline. They're also the person that is in charge and making sure that the protocol is actually followed. And so the one thing I like to say about the youth market is when you drop off your kid to go play, I don't know, U7 soccer or U7 football, something like that, and the organization hands you a document that says it's safe to drop your kid off because we have a concussion policy. If you knew that only 30% of the time that was going to happen, would you still drop the kid off? And I think it's a reality that like we have to call this out for what it is, which is the policy. It doesn't protect the athlete. It's following the policy that actually does. And at the amateur level, the gap is the biggest because they're non-medical individuals. And so you can't solve that problem by giving a non-medical person a medical tool to do medical testing. It's these protocols have to be written so that a layperson can follow it, and perhaps they're triaging the medical aspects to the healthcare system.
Hmm. And what about misconceptions? Are there any misconceptions that athletes, coaches, or even parents have about concussions within, like, let's say the youth sports ecosystem?
Yeah, I mean, even at the youth sports level, you see a lot of parents that think their kid is going to be a professional athlete, so they don't want their kid to miss time from having a head injury, right? So there's always that motivation to play, to win, to be there when scouts are on the sideline. And yeah, I would say one of the biggest misconceptions is that when somebody has a concussion, they're gonna miss time and they're gonna be out and they're gonna miss those opportunities. But the reality of it is there is published data in the research world that says the earlier you remove a player from play, if they have a head injury, the quicker they'll return. And it makes sense, right? Because let's say that you have a concussion in the first quarter of a game. If you're pulled out in the first quarter and you initiate the recovery process, you can make a full recovery and go back to play when it's safe for you to do that. And typically that's somewhere 7 to 10 days, something like that.
Hmm.
Of course, complex concussions can be much longer. But if you leave that player in and they play 3 more quarters with a brain injury, they could have another brain injury that puts them out for life. And so I think there's this misconception right now that organizations that adopt tools like this are going to have more players pulled out and more players on the sideline missing those opportunities, to go to the next level and be exposed to scouts. But it's actually the opposite. If you pull the players out and you make sure that the right ones are put back in and the ones that are not safe to return are being treated earlier, they're going to return to sport earlier in the game or earlier in potentially the season, and they'll actually be exposed to more opportunities.
How do you feel about the narrative around concussions? Because obviously you talked about the lawsuits back in, I think it was around 2012, and
Yeah.
we kind of saw an uptick in attention and awareness around concussions when the concussion movie came out. I believe that
Yeah.
was like 2015 or around that time as well. Like,
Yeah.
do you think the narrative around concussions in sports is improving, or we still have a little ways to go to be where we need to be?
So I think the awareness of it has drastically improved. I think it's impossible to play a sport nowadays in the US that has concussions occurring frequently without hearing about it or without the organizations uh, you know, talking about it or having a policy. And I guess like what I would say is when business people, so folks that run, leagues or organizations, they have to have an answer now for, well, what are you doing about concussion? And just coming back full circle to the reason why we exist, the answer that people have been giving for, since let's say that movie came out is, oh, we have a protocol. And we brought in experts from the concussion research world to design the protocol so it fits our sport and fits our level of play. And then, they pat themselves on the back and say, boom, we've solved concussion, right? But the reality of it is that not a lot of people are going to the next step, which is there's a huge difference between having a policy and following it. And I think that's where the biggest gap is right now. And that's the one that we're hoping to close.
Do you guys do anything in terms of education or providing resources to help organizations or coaches and athletes who are skeptical about concussions understand the importance and some of the, I guess, the red tape around it?
Yeah, I mean, obviously, we got to, acknowledge our market, right? Most of our users at a higher level, are medical folks,
Yeah.
but the buyer is a business person, right? So if we're messaging to the medical folks, hey, our tool is going to make it easier for you to do your job and run these tests and manage the athletes, that's going to tick a box for them. But the business folks don't care about that, right? They care about
Mhm.
risk. And so the messaging that we try to give to them is along the lines of, this is a risk that you're going to have to solve. It's a critical problem. And you can look at us as almost like a risk reduction strategy. So you can reduce the risk of having players mismanaged, which could lead to, of course, the worst outcome, which is a lawsuit. But it could also be bad PR. It could be bad word of mouth between parents, that sort of thing, that you are an unsafe organization. And again, that concept of, oh, but we have a policy, it's just not, it doesn't fly anymore.
Hmm. What advice would you give to another founder who's building in a very niche space within sports, trying to educate people on their product and get the word out there? If you had to go back, let's say 5, even 10 years ago, what advice would you have given yourself about operating within this sector and building a company around it?
Yeah, I think it really depends on whether you're trying to replace a incumbent technology or whether you're trying to create a new category. And for us, we are trying to create a new category and we're trying to own it. And so it's not like we're trying to say that we should be replacing the other companies that are out there innovating in the test space. We're saying there's already enough people doing that. They're really good at it. That's not for us. We're going to try to innovate on a different problem. And so we actually have to work with these folks. But as a result of trying to create a new category, we also have to acknowledge that we're still selling to the first, 2.5% of people on the technology adoption curve, where these are innovators, right? Like they're not going to do it because necessarily somebody else is doing it. They're doing it because they want to gain an advantage or they want to be the first to do it or they truly care about this problem. And so if you're doing that, like we are, we have to go find who those people are. And the problem with it is that in the sports world, you don't know who the innovators are, right? Like you can't just draw up a list of, hey, these are our top 10 targets because these are innovators, these are innovators, these are innovators. You have to get out there and you have to talk to them. The other thing that I think we did really early on was we just sprayed and prayed. Like we didn't know who the innovators were, so we just sent the message out there to the world, and the people that came back to us were the innovators. And I think that allowed us to get our first set of customers because they self-declared, we are the innovators. We want to be the first to do this. But at the same time, if you're trying to sell to everybody, everybody has different problems. Everybody has different values they want to get. So it's really hard to deliver 100 different values. If you could narrow that down to a much smaller market segment, like let's say that we had said, oh, we only want to do this in football in the US, then the value that we'd have to provide and the speaking points on that would be so much more narrow than what we started with. And arguably we could try to own that space. And then once we've owned it, go to the other sports and other levels. But we didn't do that. And I think we'll see how it shakes out in the end. But I think there's a couple of different strategies, but it really depends on, are you trying to replace somebody or are you trying to create a new category?
For sure. That's really good insight. If you can wave a magic wand and fix one thing about how the entire sports world handles head injuries, concussions, what would that be?
I think just looking at our data, the biggest thing that contributes to mismanaged head injuries is appropriate clearance by a qualified individual. So I'll tell you a story. Like we knew very early on that like those situations where the athlete was not being managed to the protocol, a lot of the time it was because there was no clearance being done. They were not going to somebody qualified to say, "Yep, we've checked you out. You're safe to go back to play." And so you had no idea whether that person was going to be safe on the field. And so what we did was we built a way for organizations to upload their clearance notes. And then we would check, did you have the clearance note before the multiplay or not? But the problem with that was we saw crazy things. Like we saw clearance notes from dentists. We saw clearance notes from kids drawing with crayons saying, I'm cleared and signing it
Wow.
themselves. And so we realized that, okay, it's not good enough just to build a way to do it. You actually have to be able to audit it and and potentially have it approved by somebody that knows that it was the right type of individual. So yeah, I would say the biggest thing right now, if I could wave a wand, would be that every athlete gets to an appropriate individual that can properly clear them, because that is by far the biggest gap right now in organizations complying to their own protocols.
Where do you see head check health, let's say in the next 5 years? I'm sure you probably wouldn't imagined you'd be where you are, looking back 10 years ago. But, looking at the next like 5 years or so, where do you see the company? What's the long-term vision?
Yeah, so I mean, long term, we want to accomplish our mission, right? Which is we want to eliminate concussions from being mismanaged, and that's a huge vision, right? Like that's global problem, that's all different levels. It's going to take us a long time to get there, so we want to see progress on that. And I would say where we see ourselves in 5 years is we want to be the clear market leader in this space, and we want to be seen as the trusted expert that's going after this super niche problem, and we're the folks that are the best in the world at it. And I think we can say that right now for the innovators. Like if you are an innovator out there and you have a problem with concussion, we can help solve the niche compliance issue that exists in the world. But at the end of the day, we also have to call out that as a small business with 20 staff, we're not going to be able to get to the big vision anytime soon. So how do we plot our path towards it? I mean, it's got to start with just continuing to sell to those innovators. But I would say within 5 years, we need to make that jump. Like we got to cross that chasm to the early majority. And those folks that are not innovators, they're early majority, they have completely different traits. You have to message to them differently. There's different things that they care about. And so we got to figure that out within the next 5 years. Otherwise, we're going to be stuck selling to innovators. And obviously that market size is pretty limited.
Super niche, but super important. Harrison, appreciate your time, appreciate the insights. Where can people find out more about you and Head Check Health as well?
Yeah, check out our website, headcheckhealth.com. Also hit me up on LinkedIn, just Harrison Brown. And yeah, we're always looking for new talent and talented individuals that are passionate about this problem. So obviously if you're an investor or you're a potential customer, we'd love to chat with you, but also anybody in the ecosystem, if you care about this problem, reach out.
Thank you, my friend. Appreciate your time.
Thank you.